The
We are
bell
just
above the
checking
door
in on
rang
all the
twice
local
before the three
businesses.
officers
We
stepped
want to make
inside,
sure
and the
everyone
sound seemed to
feels
hang
safe
in the
around
air a
here.
moment too long,
Let us know if
as
you
if
notice
even the
anything.
old brass knew something was
We are
wrong.
just checking in on the
Outside,
local
the
businesses
afternoon
today.
light
Have you
was the
noticed
color
anything
of wheat
unusual
tea
around here
falling
lately?
across a
No,
street
it has
that had
been pretty
seen better
quiet.
decades.
That is good to hear. Let us know if you need
Inside,
anything.
the shop smelled the way it always did: fresh bread, coffee grounds, and the faint sweetness of the candy display near the register. The lead officer set his coffee cup down on the counter without asking, the way a man does when he believes the room already belongs to him, and he smiled the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. He told Naomi Brooks that if she wanted her little shop to still be open next month, she would need to pay $5,000 in protection money. He said it lightly, almost cheerfully, as though discussing the weather rather than a threat. A customer near the bread aisle lowered his head and studied the floor, and another near the register quietly set down the milk carton he'd been holding and slipped toward the door without a word. Naomi did not raise her voice. She wiped her hands on the small towel beside the register, folded it once, and set it down with the same unhurried care she gave everything. She looked only at the badge on his chest, at the name stitched above the pocket, and asked calmly whether that order came from the department or from him alone. The three of them laughed loud and easy, the laughter of men who had never once been told no, who had built their entire authority on the assumption nobody would ever ask that question back. 12 hours later, the entire police department would be sealed off behind crime scene tape, and the woman they had just threatened would step out of a military helicopter wearing a rank that would make the whole state go silent. Long before any of that happened, Naomi Brooks was simply the woman who opened her shop at 6 every morning, rain or shine, unlocking the same green door she'd unlocked for 15 years, the hinges giving the same small creak they'd given since the day she hung the sign. She remembered names the way other people remembered song lyrics, without trying. She remembered the small details that made people feel seen: whose father was recovering from surgery, whose daughter had just started college 2 towns over. She knew Mrs. Alvarez liked her coffee dark and unsweetened, that old Mr. Fenwick always paid exact change because he hated carrying coins home, that the teenagers from the corner apartments came in after school for the same bag of chips every day, laughing too loud at something on their phones. People trusted her because in 15 years she had never once been caught cutting a corner or padding a price, never shorted a customer a nickel even when the register ran thin at the end of a hard month. The shop was small, the shelves a little crowded, the linoleum floor worn pale in a path from door to counter, the register an old model that stuck if you pressed the drawer too hard. But it was hers, and it had survived when other stores around it hadn't. The hardware store on the corner had closed. The laundromat 2 doors down had changed hands twice in 5 years. The income was modest, barely enough to keep the lights on and the rent paid. Some months she skipped her own dinner so the shelves could stay stocked. But she never complained, and never let politics or gossip cross her threshold. In the back room, behind a stack of boxes and an old filing cabinet, sat a small metal box holding a handful of military medals, wrapped in a cloth that hadn't been unfolded in years, tucked so far beneath old invoices that even she sometimes forgot exactly where it sat. Nobody in town knew what those medals meant, or what she'd done before she started stacking cans of soup and sweeping the sidewalk each morning. To them she was simply Naomi from the shop on the corner, quiet, steady, unremarkable in the best possible way, trusted precisely because she never asked to be noticed. One evening, as she was locking up, a shopkeeper from 2 doors down leaned close and whispered that this week it would be her turn. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. Naomi had noticed the changes creeping through the block for months before that whisper reached her, the way a person notices a storm building long before the first drop of rain falls. She had seen patrol cars idling outside storefronts longer than any routine check required, had seen shop owners step outside to speak with officers in low voices and come back and looking smaller than when they'd left. She had seen the bakery raise its prices twice in a single season for no reason anyone could explain, and the pharmacy start closing an hour early, its owner offering nothing but a tired shrug. For a long while she'd chosen to believe these were simply the ordinary hardships of a small business in a tired town, that whatever was happening around her wasn't hers to interfere with, that she'd left a life of interference behind when she hung up her uniform for the last time. But the whisper on the sidewalk that evening settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, and she found herself standing at her own front window long after closing, watching the empty street and thinking, for the first time in years, like someone trained to notice a threat before it fully arrived. The three officers who walked through her door the following afternoon were led by a lieutenant named Rick Dalton, a broad-shouldered man with a permanently clenched jaw and a voice that filled a room before his body did, the kind of presence that had learned long ago that most people back down before a raised voice even finishes its sentence. Two younger officers flanked the entrance, arms crossed, blocking the exit without seeming to try, their eyes drifting lazily across the shelves as though cataloging what might be worth breaking later. Dalton called it a security fee, said it so casually it almost sounded reasonable, the way a lie sounds reasonable once it's been repeated so often even the liar has stopped hearing it as one. He explained almost helpfully what would happen if she refused, ticking the possibilities off on his fingers like a checklist he'd used a dozen times before. A health inspection that found violations that didn't exist, a citation for a crack in the tile, or a thermometer reading a degree off, a permit review that dragged on for months and paperwork that mysteriously kept getting lost. Eventually, a padlock on her door and a notice on the glass that nobody in the department would ever admit to signing. He told her every other shop on the block had already paid. The bakery, the pharmacy, the laundromat with the flickering sign, as though their compliance were proof of his authority rather than evidence of a town slowly strangled into silence. She was the last holdout, he said, the stubborn exception in an otherwise obedient row of storefronts, and he said it like a warning dressed up as a compliment. Naomi asked, without a trace of fear, whether there would be a receipt for the payment. The question landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. The officers laughed again, and Dalton slammed his open palm down on the counter hard enough to rattle the register and send a rack of gum sliding off its hook. He leaned in close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and gave her 3 days. Rick Dalton had built his authority over 11 years on the force, not through skill or dedication, but through a talent for knowing exactly which superiors to flatter and which rules could be quietly bent without consequence. The scheme hadn't begun with him. Inherited in pieces from an officer who'd retired 2 years earlier and shown him, almost as a courtesy, how the arrangement worked. Dalton had simply expanded it, grown greedier and bolder each year, convinced a town this small, this tired, this used to looking away, would never produce a single person willing to stand and fight. He never once considered that the quiet woman behind the corner shop counter might be exactly that person. In the days that followed, Naomi began asking quiet questions of the people she trusted, catching them in low voices after the shop had emptied out. What she learned chilled her in a way gunfire never had. A restaurant owner 2 blocks over had lost his life savings to the payments, only to watch his restaurant close anyway when he finally ran dry. An auto repair shop had been shut down over a fabricated violation, its owner left with 20 years of work reduced to a padlocked door. A hair salon had quietly closed its blinds one afternoon and never reopened, its owner gone before anyone could ask why. Nobody dared report it, because the ones who had tried before learned quickly what silence was worth compared to retaliation. Every complaint was swallowed by an internal affairs office that somehow, every time, found no evidence of wrongdoing. The same 3 words stamped on every closed file as if in advance. Naomi understood slowly, and then all at once, walking home past darkened storefronts that had once been full of light and noise. This wasn't a handful of corrupt officers skimming a little extra off the top. This was an entire system, built brick by brick, protected by silence and fear, reaching into every corner of a town too tired and too frightened to fight back. She found the restaurant owner, a heavy-set man named Walter Higgins, sitting alone in his darkened dining room one evening, chairs stacked upside down on the tables around him. When she asked gently what had happened, he told her the whole story without once raising his eyes from the table. The first visit, when the amount had seemed almost reasonable, and every visit after, when the number crept higher and the excuses grew thinner. He'd gone to the city council once, quietly, and been told to speak with internal affairs, who took his statement, thanked him for his time, and closed the file within a week without a single follow-up call. After that, he'd stopped believing speaking up changed anything, and simply kept paying until there was nothing left to pay with. Naomi listened without interrupting, the old instinct to gather information before acting settling over her the way it always had. When Walter finally looked up, eyes tired and red-rimmed, she told him only that she understood, and that she wouldn't forget what he'd told her. She left his darkened restaurant that night carrying his story the way she'd once carried classified briefings, sealed away where nothing could accidentally spill it before the time was right. That night, alone in the back room, the overhead light humming faintly, Naomi knelt beside the old filing cabinet and pulled the metal box free from beneath a stack of dusty invoices. Her hands paused on the lid the way hands sometimes pause before opening a door to a room that's been closed a long time, uncertain whether the person on the other side still exists at all. Inside, beneath the folded cloth, was not money, not paperwork, but a Delta Force beret, its fabric worn soft, its color faded but unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Beneath it sat a handful of ribbons and a single dog tag, its edges worn smooth from being turned over between someone's fingers during long nights she no longer let herself remember too closely. She lifted the beret out and held it in both hands, and for a moment the small back room fell away entirely, replaced by the memory of briefing rooms and transport planes and the particular silence that settles over a team in the last minute before a door opens onto darkness. 22 years of her life had been spent in uniform, almost none of it ever spoken aloud to another soul in this town. She had served in Delta Force, commanded operations that never appeared in any newspaper, led counterterrorism missions in places whose names were never printed on a civilian map. She had once led an internal investigation into corruption within her own ranks, a mission that taught her exactly how deep rot could grow when nobody was watching closely enough to notice. She had commanded hostage rescue operations where a single wrong decision meant the difference between a family reunited and a family destroyed, and led coalition forces across borders that existed only on classified documents. Her file, if anyone in this town had ever thought to look for it, was sealed and buried under layers of clearance most people never knew existed. She had left the service after a final mission that cracked something loose in her, a mission where she watched power used not to protect but to punish, where someone with authority twisted it into something cruel simply because nobody in the room had the courage to stop him. She'd walked away from the only life she'd ever known because she no longer trusted people who wielded that kind of authority without accountability, and come home to build something small and honest, a shop where nobody owed her anything, and she owed nothing to anyone, where the only battles she fought were against a stubborn cash register and a supplier who was always a day late. Now, sitting in the back room with the beret in her hands, she made a decision as quiet and final as anything she'd ever decided on a battlefield. She would not pay. In the 2 days that followed, Naomi went about her routine exactly as always, opening at 6, sweeping the sidewalk, greeting every customer by name, giving no outward sign anything inside her had shifted. But quietly, in the hours before dawn, she found herself falling back into old habits she'd thought she'd left behind for good, noting exits and sightlines the way she once noted them before every mission, cataloging which shelves offered cover and which offered none, watching the street through the front window a little longer than she used to before turning the lock each night. She wasn't planning violence. She had no intention of meeting force with force. But 22 years of training didn't simply switch off because a person traded a rifle for a cash register. And some part of her, the part that had once kept entire teams alive in hostile places, was already 3 steps ahead of whatever Rick Dalton believed he still controlled. The officers returned 2 days later, and this time there was no pretense of civility. Dalton walked the aisles sweeping cans and boxes onto the floor with the back of his forearm, watching them scatter without a flicker of concern, stepping over shattered glass jars of preserves as though it were beneath his notice. One of the younger officers ripped the security camera from its mount above the register and tossed it onto the counter, wires trailing like torn nerves. Dalton threatened to arrest Naomi on the spot, inventing a charge as easily as he'd invented the health code violations, daring her to argue, his voice rising until it filled every corner of the small shop. Unknown to any of them, a customer near the back had quietly lifted a phone and begun recording, the device tucked low against a shelf, the red light hidden beneath a folded jacket, capturing every word. Dalton, emboldened by what he believed was total control of the room, planted his boots wide and announced to the shop at large that around here, he was the law, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who'd never once faced a consequence he couldn't talk his way around. Naomi did not fight back. She did not raise her hands or her voice, did not give him the satisfaction of watching her break, standing instead with the same stillness she might have once held during a briefing before a mission neither of them could have imagined. She only told him that he had just said something very dangerous, and something in the stillness of her voice made even Dalton pause, a flicker of doubt crossing his face before he laughed it off and walked out with his men, boots crunching over broken glass. That night, after the shop was locked and the street gone quiet, the neon pharmacy sign humming faintly across the road, Naomi sat at the small desk in her back room and wrote an email. She didn't send it to a local newspaper or a city council member or even the state attorney general, all of whom she knew could be reached, delayed, or quietly ignored. She sent it to the Defense Criminal Investigation Service, using credentials and a case reference number that hadn't been active in years but had never technically expired, numbers she'd memorized so long ago her fingers typed them without thinking. Attached was a summary of everything she'd learned, dates, names. A joint task force was quietly assembled, its existence known to almost nobody outside a handful of secure offices. The team included a senior agent from the Bureau's Public Corruption Division, a forensic accountant who'd spent her career tracing dirty money through shell companies, and a Department of Defense liaison whose only job was to confirm, quietly, that the woman at the center of the complaint was in fact who her file claimed. When that confirmation came through on a secure terminal, the room went still before the senior agent finally spoke, saying only that they needed to move carefully and move fast, because whatever was happening in that small town had clearly been happening far longer than anyone outside it had realized. Investigators began pulling threads that unraveled far more than a single shakedown at a corner store. Protection payments collected across dozens of businesses going back years, money laundering routed through shell accounts tied to officers and relatives, extortion built into the daily rhythm of patrol routes and assets, boats, vacation homes, registered under cousins, and in-laws who'd never once set foot in a patrol car. An order came down from someone whose name never appeared on paper, put the entire department under surveillance. The plan that followed required Naomi to do something that went against every instinct she'd spent years honing, and yet was, in its own way, exactly the kind of operation she'd once run without hesitation. She agreed to hand over the money. Dalton could barely contain his satisfaction when she called to arrange the drop, certain he'd finally broken the one holdout on his list, his voice loose and pleased in a way that told her he'd already stopped paying attention. What he didn't know was that every bill handed to him had already been marked, its serial numbers logged and cross-referenced against a database that would trace each one the moment it entered a bank. He didn't know a federal camera tucked into the awning across the street had a clear line of sight to the exchange, or that a hidden microphone sewn into the seam of Naomi's jacket was carrying every word directly to a room full of investigators listening in real time, headsets pressed tight, pens moving fast. Dalton took the money and folded it into his jacket with the casual confidence of a man who'd done this 100 times, counting it once with his thumb, and told Naomi almost proudly that nobody could touch him. She looked at him for a long moment, the late afternoon light catching the edge of his badge, and asked simply whether he was certain of that. The raid came the following morning, arriving with the kind of coordinated silence that only comes from careful planning. Unmarked vehicles rolled into position before the town had finished its first pot of coffee. Federal agents moved in alongside the DOJ, state police, and forensic accountants who'd spent days tracing every dollar back to its source. The entire police department was sealed off within minutes. Officers ordered to stand down and surrender their weapons while search warrants were read aloud in the parking lot. Agents found a hidden safe behind a false panel in the records room, stacks of unmarked cash rubber-banded into bundles that had never touched a bank, and ledgers listing names and amounts that matched almost perfectly with the businesses Naomi had already identified. They confiscated phones, hard drives, and secret accounts funneling money for years, some traced to a boat registered 3 counties over, some hidden in the name of an uncle dead 6 years. One of the younger officers, the same one who'd ripped the camera from Naomi's register, sat on the curb with his head in his hands, already talking, already offering names and dates in exchange for a smaller sentence. The loyalty that once bound the department together dissolving the moment the handcuffs came out. Dalton stood in the middle of the parking lot, cuffed hands hanging in front of him, utterly unable to process what was happening, asking the agents nearest him who had done this, who had turned on him, as if the answer could not possibly be the quiet woman who ran the corner shop. Then, cutting through the noise and confusion, the low rhythmic beat of rotor blades grew louder overhead, dust swirling up from the cracked asphalt, and a military helicopter began its descent onto the parking lot of the department that had once believed itself untouchable. The doors opened, and Naomi stepped down onto the pavement, not in the apron she wore behind her register, nor the plain clothes she wore sweeping her sidewalk, but a dress uniform, pressed and precise, insignia catching the morning light in a way that made several senior officers on scene straighten their backs and salute before their minds had even finished processing what they were seeing. Muscle memory answering the uniform before conscious thought could catch up. Dalton stared at her, mouth slightly open, the color draining from his face as understanding arrived far too late to do him any good. The woman he'd mocked across her own counter, now standing before him with a bearing he'd seen only in training films. Naomi had never once, in 15 years, told a single soul in that town what she'd done before she opened her shop. Never let it slip. Never used it to gain an advantage or command respect she hadn't already earned honestly through 15 years of remembering names and counting exact change. One of the lead investigators stepped forward and told Dalton, in words clear enough for everyone nearby to hear, that he had just tried to extort a woman who had once commanded some of the nation's most sensitive special operations missions. Missions most of the men standing in that parking lot would never be cleared to read about even now. The officers around the lot, men who moments earlier had considered themselves untouchable, lowered their eyes to the ground one after another, the weight of what they'd allowed to happen settling onto their shoulders, the silence spreading through the lot heavier than any siren could have been. Somewhere near the edge of the lot, one of the older officers, a man who'd served under 3 different chiefs and grown numb to the arrangement long before Dalton ever rose to lead it, quietly told a younger colleague that he'd always known this day would come, that a debt built on fear eventually comes due one way or another. Dalton was led toward a waiting vehicle in handcuffs, his protests growing quieter with every step, the bravado that had carried him through years of quiet extortion finally failing him completely, until finally he said nothing at all. The courtroom was full on the first day of the trial, rows of benches packed with shop owners who'd once been too afraid to say a word. The prosecution laid out its case methodically, playing the recording from the marked money drop and projecting photographs of the hidden safe for the jury to study. Walter Higgins testified about the envelopes he'd handed over month after month, his voice steady even as his hands trembled against the witness stand. The trial did not take long, the evidence too complete for any defense to meaningfully contest. Dalton received a sentence that would keep him behind bars for a significant portion of the years he had left, his face unreadable as the judge read the terms aloud. The officers who'd followed his lead were convicted alongside him, some receiving lesser sentences, others losing their badges and pensions in a single afternoon. The extortion network was dismantled piece by piece, its remaining members removed from the department, the roster rebuilt from scratch under new leadership brought in from outside the county. Victims who'd lost savings, storefronts, and years of their lives to fear were finally compensated through a fund established for the case. When the final sentence was read aloud, a quiet murmur passed through the rows of benches. Not celebration exactly, but something close to relief, the sound of people finally allowed to exhale after holding their breath for years. Shops that had been padlocked for months reopened their doors, some owners weeping quietly as they turned keys that had sat untouched for so long. Naomi refused every interview request, turned down television crews and reporters alike, declined even the small recognition ceremonies the town tried to arrange, and simply returned to her shop as though nothing extraordinary had happened. One reporter, more persistent than the rest, caught her one morning restocking shelves near the front window and asked directly why she had never told anyone she'd once served in Delta Force. Naomi paused, set the box gently onto the shelf, and considered the question with the same calm she'd shown Dalton on the very first day he walked through her door. She told the reporter that honor was never something you wore. Naomi never spoke of what she'd once been to anyone in town, not even in the quiet weeks after the trial, when people finally understood in broad strokes what she'd done. She never corrected the rumors that grew wilder with each retelling, never confirmed or denied the stories that spread about helicopters and generals and secret files. She simply let the town believe whatever version of the truth felt right to them, content in knowing the only version that actually mattered was the one that had kept her neighbors' doors open. In the weeks that followed, Walter Higgins reopened his restaurant with a fresh coat of paint and a new sign above the door. On opening night, he left a single table reserved near the window, untouched, a small card resting on it that simply read, "Thank you," though he never told anyone exactly who it was meant for. The auto repair shop reopened as well, and the bakery lowered its prices back to what they'd been 2 years earlier. The pharmacy began keeping its old hours again, its owner no longer glancing nervously toward the door every time it opened. Slowly, the block began to breathe again, the particular kind of quiet that comes not from fear, but from safety. The following morning arrived quiet and ordinary, sunlight spilling gently across the cracked sidewalk, catching the dust motes drifting through the front window. The bell above the door rang once as the first customer of the day stepped inside, and Naomi looked up from behind the counter and smiled the way she always had, the way she'd smiled at every customer for 15 years before any of this happened. She poured coffee for Mrs. Alvarez, dark and unsweetened, and counted out exact change for old Mr. Fenwick without being asked, his coins clinking softly into his palm the way they always had. The teenagers from the corner apartments came in after school, laughing too loud at something on their phones, and bought the same bag of chips they always bought, the ordinary rhythm of the world reasserting itself one small transaction at a time. The register stuck on the same drawer it always stuck on. The same creak greeted every customer who pushed through the green door. On the wall behind the counter, where a calendar had once hung crooked and forgotten, there now hung an American flag beside a single worn beret, no longer hidden away in a backroom drawer, visible now to anyone who cared to look up. Nobody who walked through that door looked at Naomi Brooks as a victim anymore. They looked at her as an ordinary woman who had quietly stood her ground and protected an entire community, proving that real power was never meant to intimidate. It was meant to protect.